Well, welcome to the show. It's the 28th of March, 2025. The US administration has moved quickly to implement a raft of tariffs as part of a wider effort to reconfigure the domestic economic structures of the United States and the relationships between the US economy and those of other countries in the world. We've already seen the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminium, and soon the US administration is set to implement its so-called reciprocal tariff measures. These tariff measures will have ripple effects across global supply chains, including those in Australia. As we count down the days to when the reciprocal tariffs come into effect, I'm joined by Felicity Dean, Professor of Trade Law, Taxation and Climate Change at Queensland University of Technology. Professor Dean has recently penned an article in The Conversation, which goes into some of these issues. I'll link to that article in the video description below. Today's conversation aims to unpack the situation as it stands and explore what some of the implications are likely to be. Welcome to the discussion, Felicity.
Thank you so much.
It's great to see you again. So let's get started. Could you just give us a brief overview, some of the background as to the tariffs that have already been implemented and the impending reciprocal tariffs?
Absolutely. Well, look, it's been a busy few months, really. So this was not something that was a shock. We were well aware that tariffs were probably going to hit around about January, February this year, and we were disappointed. So the steel and aluminium tariffs, they had been in place in previous years, in previous administrations. That's actually the subject of a current World Trade Organization dispute. There are some distinct differences between the previous position of those tariffs and the ones that we are seeing implemented now. However, they have been shown to infringe World Trade Organization obligations and not to be excused by the national security exception that has been trotted out as a way of justifying them. So that we've seen these things in place for quite some time. The United States has been drifting towards a more protectionist type of approach when it comes to their trading partners. Free trade has been prioritised really since the end of World War II. It was seen as being more than just about trade. It was seen as being something that could ensure international relations. And since World War II, there was this trend towards free trade rules, opening up borders and ensuring that consumers had access to products from all over the world. However, I think it's fair to say that we have shifted slightly in that respect, and the neoliberalism approach is being replaced by the idea that we need to start putting up more metaphorical walls towards free trade and protecting domestic industries a little more.
So in your article, you mentioned that the reciprocal tariffs measures from the United States in effect undermine or walk back on the bilateral commitments made between Canberra and Washington 20 years ago now, in 2005, under the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement. Can you just explain a little about what that agreement entailed and how the measures from the current US administration relate to that agreement?
Absolutely. So that agreement covers a range of different products and services that are the subject of trade between the two nations. And the idea was that over time, that gradually any barriers to trade would be removed. Predominantly tariffs would be removed. Now, this was certainly the case when it came to red meat, such as beef and other products. And pharmaceuticals were strangely not supposed to be part of it, but they did end up on the negotiating table back 20 years ago. Now, look, there's many other goods and services that form part of it, and obviously we don't know what exactly the April 2nd tariffs are going to look like. So there could be all sorts of things that infringe those agreements. But to my knowledge, both sides have honoured the promises they made 20 years ago. I do know that some legislative changes were introduced in Australia to respond to some of those measures, including for our pharmaceutical benefits scheme, which, like I said, it wasn't supposed to form part of negotiations, but it did end up in letters which were annexed to the agreement. So, like I said, up until this point, the agreement's been honoured, and one of those agreements was that there would be absolutely zero tariffs on any Australian beef that entered the US market from 2018, I believe, off the top of my head. They were to be introduced over time. It was to gradually reduce, which did occur since 2018. There was supposed to be zero. So if there are tariffs imposed on our red meat products, then that will clearly be a problem for that agreement. Similarly, well, the pharmaceuticals didn't form part of the agreement, but the fact that it was annexed does show a degree of goodwill between countries when it comes to pharmaceuticals.
Now, Australia exports quite a lot of beef to the United States, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the largest export to the United States. I can't think of the number off the top of my head. I feel like you might know that one.
Well, let that be a little bit of homework for our viewers. Perhaps they can look that up. But it is a large contributor to Australia's exports to the United States. But under the Free Trade Agreement over the course of the last 20 years, Australia has also been a significant importer of a broad range of products from the United States too, correct?
That is true. To be perfectly honest with you, I have been less concerned with researching what those products actually are. We do have some pharmaceuticals, obviously, that come in here, but we are a net importer of US products, usually. In a lot of instances we are. But there was a recent, I can't recall the exact measure of it, but there was a recent instance because of the gold being exported to the US. It meant that our terms of trade were slightly different than usual, which was, some would say, reasonably bad timing, but little that you can do about that.
But the broad pattern has been that Australia has been a net importer of products from America. Now, on
almost exclusively.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, on the beef front, I mean, we have, worked in relation to the beef industry on and off over the years, but I'd just like to dive into it a little bit more because of the categories of things that may be impacted by this reciprocal tariff arrangement. Beef and pharmaceuticals are the big ticket items. Could you give us a flavour, so to speak, of the potential implications for the Australian red meat sector of such tariffs and how the Australian red meat sector may be impacted and ultimately compelled to respond? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part really goes to what this may mean for American consumers, including the restaurants and catering sector, should there be an increase in the costs of Australian red meat into that market?
Okay, two-part question. Let's see if I can remember that. So the first part of your question and the impacts on the red meat sector and how should they respond? Look, it's an excellent question. And the short answer is the direct impacts obviously depend on exactly what these tariffs look like. If it's at the higher end of the spectrum, that it could impact on the demand for Australian beef products. It could drive up the cost of Australian beef products in the United States. However, predominantly our beef exports to the US, it's not the super high quality stuff that's ending up in the US, it's more the types of burgers that you see at McDonald that Australian beef is featured in. And so whether that's going to be impacted by what could be potentially a modest tariff is yet to be seen. Certain groups have released statements about their reactions to these tariffs, and it's been reasonably understated, and potentially with good reason. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of concern at this point, to be perfectly honest. However, we know these tariffs aren't going to be exclusively imposed on Australia, if indeed they are imposed. And again, we don't really know all the details there. But what it could do is change the global market in different ways, depending on how they're imposed elsewhere. And it could change the demand from different countries for some of these high quality products that do go elsewhere. We're just not entirely sure, what could happen there and the flow-on effects, both with this one and obviously the steel tariffs could be more drastic than the direct impacts. How should they respond? That's an excellent question. I think, the very calm response that we're seeing at the moment is a good one. If the results really do impact on trade severely, then I think it's time to start talking to the Australian government about looking at ways to enforce these free trade agreements that we do have. There are ways to enforce agreements. We do have processes that can be followed. We are, of course, a member of the World Trade Organization, as is the United States, and we can initiate a dispute there, which forces countries into consultations. Similarly, there's dispute mechanisms under the free trade agreement that we have with the US. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been a dispute under that agreement yet, but it could be time for the first one if indeed the impact is severe. In terms of how it could impact consumers in the United States, what we do know is that usually tariffs are passed on to consumers. It doesn't always happen, but it's usually the case. Obviously, the suppliers of beef would drop their prices. The beef supply chain, as we know, is very complex, and somewhere along the line, these additional costs could be absorbed. However, that is reasonably unlikely. And so for whatever percentage the tariff is imposed, it's likely to drive up that cost. And as mentioned, even though we're not talking about these high quality products, so it may not be a drastic increase, we do know that there's a lot of families in the United States who do rely on food that is reasonably inexpensive to feed their families, so it could impact on those more severely than those in the higher income brackets.
Yeah, I find it kind of interesting that something like red meats will be affected because the ostensible driver behind the broader tariff ambition is to rejuvenate American manufacturing. And whilst it could be said that red meat is a form of food manufacturing, it is nonetheless constrained by the speed at which one can expand the cattle herd, which is again constrained by the availability of land, water, feed, and of course the rate at which cattle reproduce. Now, moving on though from the meat industry, the most touchy one seems to be the potential impacts on the Australian Pharmaceuticals Benefit Scheme and the pharmaceuticals industry broadly speaking. Could you paint a picture for us in terms of, firstly, the background of the pharmaceuticals benefit scheme and how it has been exposed, I guess, to the risks of this particular set of tariff proposals?
Absolutely. So the pharmaceutical benefit scheme has also been in place for a very, very long time. So in the 1940s, there was a referendum to ensure that the Commonwealth government could introduce a measure such as the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, which does supply less expensive medication for all Australian residents. So if you have a Medicare card, you are entitled to medicines at a certain rate if they are on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. If you are a pensioner or a low-income individual, then you're entitled to even cheaper. So it's quite a subsidy from the Australian government. Now, this pharmaceutical benefit scheme also involves these pharmaceutical companies negotiating directly with the Australian government. There is essentially one big consumer of pharmaceuticals in this country, and it is the government. And so when they're negotiating as to whether a particular medication is going to end up on pharmaceutical benefits scheme, they will obviously try and get the best price possible for the scheme. We as consumers don't necessarily pay that price. Like I've said, that's still subsidised by the government, but still there were concerns from the pharmaceutical industry in the United States that this was a form of non-trade barrier. Not only that, but concerns around the time it took to notify companies whether they were accepted as part of this scheme was also considered to be prohibitive. So there were a number of concerns, and the reason that this was flagged as something that could potentially come up, not only it was a very prickly issue during the free trade agreement negotiations. Like I said, it wasn't supposed to be on the table, ended up in the annex to the agreement. We also saw a report. Now, this was a Biden administration report that came out in 2024 showing that, in fact, there were a number of non-tariff barriers to trade, and this listed such things as beef and pharmaceuticals. So that alerted us, but then we also found out that there was some lobbying going on from the pharmaceutical industry saying that the pharmaceutical benefits scheme was prohibitive and most definitely a non-tariff barrier to trade. Far stronger words were used than that in relation to the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Now, that doesn't mean that anything needs to change on Australia's end in terms of the PBS, although it has become an election issue as well. And there has been promises that it will not be touched regardless of what these tariffs may look like, which I think is reassuring, because it's up to the Australian government as to how this pharmaceutical benefits scheme changes. It's not up to the government of another country. It has been shown to not be infringing any trade rules whatsoever. These rules, along with the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, apply to any pharmaceuticals, whether they are Australian or whether they're coming from another country. So it's not a non-tariff barrier to trade whatsoever. And if there are any changes to it, and I'm going to back both political parties because they have said that they won't touch it, regardless of what these tariffs are. It could, however, impact on pharmaceuticals that are being exported to the US, because that could increase the price over there, which of course could impact on the consumers over there as well.
Perhaps one of the unintended consequences of this is that it has put the question of national policy sovereignty fairly and squarely on the table. Perhaps inadvertently, because trade policy, in many ways, is not quite meant to do this, but it seems that in some ways it has. But you also touched on the potential avenues, both through the free trade agreement, but also through the multilateral bodies of the World Trade Organization, for a country like Australia to pursue actions. Now, what likelihood, in the context of the current US administration's attitudes towards multilateral bodies, do you think a country like Australia has of succeeding, number one? And secondly, given the timeframes involved in these sorts of mechanisms, do you think that there are other measures that could be taken in parallel?
Now, there's an excellent question. In terms of the success, do I think negotiations or consultations are going to be successful? Highly unlikely. Do I think that they'll be successful in terms of any dispute that then follows? So what happens? You initiate consultations. If you can't come to an agreement, then a panel is formed. The panel is made up of experts who can't be from any of either the parties to the dispute, and they look at what the dispute involves and consider whether it infringes these agreements. The success of that does not have anything to do with the attitude of either of the countries. It's purely a legal dispute. Do these measures infringe the agreements, these rules that have been agreed between the parties to the organisation? And look, do I think that that will be successful? Probably. I think that there's a very good chance to show that these do infringe World Trade Organization rules, or alternatively, if we look at the free trade agreement, depending on how these are introduced, or even any tariffs placed on products like beef, will absolutely be in violation of that agreement. Now, the bigger problem, however, and you just noticed a big sigh, is that with the World Trade Organization, that doesn't end things necessarily. So a panel decides these tariffs are in violation of this agreement. That's all well and good. It's a moral victory. However, it can still be appealed because there is a sitting body under the World Trade Organization known as the Appellate Body. Now, we currently don't have sufficient members of the Appellate Body because the membership has been blocked. After a certain period of time, your position as an Appellate Body member does expire and needs to be replaced. But new membership has been blocked, in fact, by the United States administration for quite some time. So we can't blame the most recent events on that at all. However, it has been blocked for some time, and it means that if an appeal comes from a panel dispute, then it appeals into the void at the moment. It doesn't go anywhere. And there are many disputes waiting to be decided by a future appellate body once we get past a period of having those appointments blocked, if indeed we do. One of those appeals is about steel and aluminium tariffs that were imposed several years ago. As in, I believe it was 6 or 7 years ago that those were imposed now, but that is waiting to be appealed because the panel has determined that it is in violation of the agreement. So will it succeed? I think so. Will it achieve anything? Potentially unlikely. Other things that could be done? Well, that's a very good question. I certainly don't agree with imposing reciprocal tariffs on United States products for the simple reason that we've discussed in terms of where tariffs are usually felt, and that's by consumers. Now, we have had high tariffs in this country in the past. You might recall, I can't really remember the time, but I do recall that it did used to be a lot harder to get.
It was before your time, Felicity, but perhaps I can remember it.
I don't think entirely. I was on the edge of it maybe, but we used to be very difficult to get products over here and to get cheap products. Buying televisions used to be extremely hard. And so we went through this period of lowering our tariffs. We've opened up trade. There are more options now for consumers. You can get products far cheaper than in the past. We know we're in a cost of living crisis at the moment. I don't think there's any secret about that whatsoever. So introducing tariffs is only going to make things potentially worse.
Look, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to throw a little bit of a big picture curveball at you. Obviously, there are some big challenges on questions of national sovereignty that we've touched on, but it also seems to raise a wider question around the long-run attitudes of countries like Australia to multilateral trading institutions and what impact this set of tariff moves by the United States will have on those institutions. Perhaps over the next couple of minutes at the most, you could just give us a sense of what the future, say over the next 10 years, may look like. And it is speculative, of course.
I think it's a bit scary, to be perfectly honest. Look, the system that we had was not perfect. There were a lot of critics of it. Neoliberalism was a bit of a dirty word for a lot of people. But the idea was that we were progressing towards fairness and supporting, different stages of economic development in a positive way. I also have the personal view that trade is more than just goods and services. And clearly it is in this day and age, it is more than goods and services, but it's also about international relations. It's also about removing those barriers to negotiations on other things. And if I may sidestep a little for a moment, just to mention, we do have a lot of big global challenges that we're facing. You know, a lot of the big challenges of this generation, they're not local, they are global, and we have to figure out how to work together to try and address them in meaningful ways. And I think that we are actually moving backwards on that, to be perfectly honest, which is why these latest developments have alarmed me, and why I have made the point that, you know, I think Australia should show that we believe in multilateralism. We believe in good international relations. We believe that there should be rules to govern these relationships, and we intend to play by those rules, and we expect others to do the same. Now, whether that's going to have any real impact whatsoever, I don't know, but we can certainly make the point accordingly.
Well, look, on that note, Felicity Dean, thank you very much for your insights.